I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, catching up on the bank balance and wondering if I could convince Fritz to try a new brand of chili sauce, when the doorbell rang. It was 9:14 Tuesday morning. Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, where he'd been since 9, communion with his orchids being the only religion he practiced with any regularity. When I looked through the one-way glass of the front door, I didn't see a client. I saw a problem. He was leaning against the stone pillar, looking like he'd been put through a meat grinder and then loosely stitched back together. His suit was expensive, or had been before the blood got to it. I opened the door, but I didn't let him in, not yet. If you're looking for the hospital, it's a few blocks over, I said. If you're looking for Nero Wolfe, you've got the wrong time of day, and likely the wrong temperament. The man looked up. His eyes were glassy, tracking me like a slow-motion camera. He said Wolfe would know. Tell him that black invitation is revoked. Then he did the one thing you should never do on the doorstep of a man who prizes order above all else. He collapsed. Across the threshold, I checked his pulse. He was still with us, but barely. The blood was coming from a neat, professional puncture in his side. I dragged him inside, mostly to keep the neighbors from calling the cops, and closed the door. I looked at the rug. It was Persian, and it wasn't going to appreciate what was happening to it. I buzzed the plant rooms on the house phone, when Wolfe's voice came through. It sounded like a man being interrupted during a coronation. "Yes, Archie, we have a visitor," I said, keeping my voice as flat as a Kansas highway. "He's currently horizontal in the hallway. He mentioned something called a black invitation, and then decided to leak all over the rug." There was silence on the other end, not the silence of a man thinking, but the silence of a man deciding how much he was going to hate the next hour. "Is he dead?" "Not yet. But he's working on it. Call Dr. Vollmer." "And Archie? Yeah? Do not move him into the office. I will not have the atmosphere of my work contaminated by the physical realities of the street." I hung up. That was Wolfe for you. A man is dying on his floorboards, and his primary concern is the atmosphere. I called Vol. Then I went back to the hallway. I went through the man's pockets. No wallet, no keys, no ID, just a single heavy card, matte black, with nothing on it but a gold-embossed number, 14. By the time Vollmer arrived, and we had the stranger stabilized and tucked away in a spare room, Wolfe's orders were specific about which room, naturally. The genius of West 35th Street had descended in the elevator. He didn't go to the guest room. He went to his desk, sat in his custom-built chair that can support a fifth of a ton of genius, and stared at the spot on the rug where the man had fallen. "Fritz is cleaning the hallway," I informed him, taking my seat at my own desk. "Vollmer says he'll live, but he won't be talking for a while. He had this in his pocket." I tossed the black card onto his blow. Wolfe didn't pick it up. He wouldn't touch it if he thought it might be tacky. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. 14, he murmured. "A vulgar number. I've always been partial to 7 myself," I said. "But 14 seems to be the one that got him a hole in his ribs. Who is he, and what's a black invitation?" Wolfe leaned back, his chin sinking into the folds of his neck. "It is a relic of a past, I thought, buried under 20 years of silence, Archie. It represents a dinner party that was never supposed to happen, and now, it seems, the host has decided to serve a different kind of course." He looked at the clock. It was nearly lunch. "We shall take the case," he announced. "What case?" "We don't have a client. We just have a dry cleaning bill for the rug." The intrusion, It's the client, Archie. Someone has used my doorstep as a dumping ground for their failures. I will not have it. He didn't look at me. He was looking at the black card, and for the first time in a year I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that looked suspiciously like genuine irritation. By the time the clock on the mantel struck 1, the Brownstone didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a pressurized vessel. Fritz had managed to lift the stain from the Persian rug, but the scent of vinegar and ammonia lingered in the air, a chemical reminder that the outside world had bled into our hallway. Wolfe was at the dining table, his movements with the fish fork as precise and deliberate as a diamond cutter's. Yet I noticed he hadn't commented once on the sauce. For Wolfe, silence regarding food is the loudest form of protest. The guest room on the 3rd floor held our mystery guest, and Dr. Vollmer had returned to his own lunch after assuring us that the man, whom I had taken to calling number 14, was resting under the influence of enough sedatives to keep a rhinoceros stationary. We were essentially harboring a John Doe with a puncture wound, and if Inspector Kramer got wind of it, he'd be on the porch with a warrant and a cigar-chewing fit of rage before the coffee was poured. "You realize," I said, breaking the silence as I buttered a roll, "that the legal definition of what we were doing right now involves words like obstruction and accessory. Not to mention that if he kicks the bucket upstairs, we'll have to explain why we didn't call the precinct Wall." Fay wiped his lips with his linen napkin. "The man sought asylum, Archie. To hand him over to the blundering machinery of the police department before he can speak would be an act of intellectual cowardice. Furthermore, he mentioned the black invitation. This is not a police matter. They would find nothing but a void. Well, the void is currently taking up space in the yellow room," I countered. "And unless you've developed telepathy, we're at a standstill. Do you know him?" "I know the suit," Wolfe remarked, his voice dropping an octave into that grumble that signifies deep distaste. "The cut is unmistakable. London, Savile Row, likely H. Huntsman and Sons. The man is a professional of high standing or a scoundrel of even higher ambition. As for the invitation, it was an arrangement made TW. 20 years ago among a group of men who believed that certain international disputes could be settled over a dinner table rather than a battlefield. Before I could ask which battlefields he was talking about, the doorbell rang again. This time it wasn't a slumped body. It was a rhythmic, demanding series of chimes that suggested whoever was on the other side felt they owned the sidewalk. I checked the brass bolt and peered through the wicket. There were 3 of them. One was a tall, lean glass of water in a charcoal overcoat who looked like he'd been born in a boardroom. Flanking him were 2 shadows, men with thick necks and hands that stayed deep in their pockets. They weren't there to sell magazines. I went back to the dining room. The neighborhood is getting popular. A high wren, T-type and 2 bookends. They look like they've come to collect their property. Wolfe didn't even look up from his endive. "Show the gentleman into the office. The others may wait on the stoop. If they resist, inform them that police are already en route to investigate a reported assault. It is a lie, but it is a functional one." I followed instructions. The tall one, who introduced himself as Saint Erling Vane, didn't like the idea of his muscles staying outside, but I gave him my best not on your life smile and leaned against the doorframe until he conceded. I ushered Vane into the office, where the air was thick with the scent of old books and Wolfe's proprietary brand of genius. Vane didn't sit. He stood in the center of the rug, looking around the room with a clinical sort of disdain. "I'm told a man arrived here this morning." "A man who does not belong to you, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe entered a moment later, the elevator's groan announcing his arrival. He navigated the space behind his desk and lowered himself into his chair with a sigh that could have been mistaken for a small landslide. He ignored Vane for a full 30 seconds, adjusting a pen on his desk and checking the water lev. L in his glass. "Many things do not belong to me, Mr. Vane," Wolfe finally said, his tone dry. "The stars, the subway system, and the prevailing winds, to name a few. Your arrival is abrupt and your premise is thin. To which man do you refer?" Vane's jaw tightened. "Let's not play the eccentric, Wolfe. We know Arthur Penhaligon, sought refuge here. He is a disturbed individual who is made off WI, sensitive materials. He is also in need of medical attention, which I'm sure you are not equipped to provide." "He's getting the best care a guest room can offer," I chimed in from my desk, tilting my chair back. "And he looked less disturbed and more perforated when he arrived. Care to explain the hole in his side?" Vane turned his cold gaze toward me. "An unfortunate accident during his flight. He is prone to delusions of persecution. If you surrender him to us, we will ensure he reaches a private facility. If you do not, this will become an affair of state, and your little fortress here will be dismantled brick by brick." Wolfe's eyes went shut. This was the sign that he was either bored or about to dismantle someone's logic. "An affair of state? How quaint. You speak with the practiced arrogance of a man who believes his payroll justifies his insolence. However, you have made a tactical error. You mentioned Arthur Penhaligon. If he is indeed the man upstairs, then he is a guest in my house. In this house, my word is the only state that matters." "You're making a mistake," Vane said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "There are interests involved that you cannot comprehend." "I comprehend plenty," Wolfe snapped, his eyes popping open. "I comprehend that you have trespassed upon my morning, threatened my home, and insulted my intelligence. Archie, show Mr. Vane to the door. If his companions on the stoop have grown impatient, feel free to use the phone to summon Mr. Kramer. I believe he has been looking for an excuse to exercise his sirens." Vane looked like he wanted to reach across the desk, but he caught me shifting my weight and decided against it. He turned on his heel and marched out. I followed him to the front door, watched him join his two shadows, and stayed there until their black sedan disappeared around the corner toward 8th Avenue. I walked back into the office. Wolfe was staring at the black card again. "He called him Penhaligon," I said, "and he seemed pretty sure we wouldn't want the trouble he's bringing." "On the contrary, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice sounding almost satisfied. "Mr. Vane has just provided the one thing I was lacking, a sense of direction. If Penhaligon is the man I think he is, he was the keeper of the Black Invitations roster, and if Vane is hunting him, then the dinner party isn't just a memory. It's a target." He tapped the card. "We need more information. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him I need the history of Sterling Vane, every bank account, every mistress, and every silent partner. And Archie, tell Fritz to lock the basement entrance. The sanctity of this house has been challenged. I intend to make them regret the intrusion." I headed for the phone. The case was no longer just a bleeding man on a rug. T was a siege. And when Nero Wolfe feels besieged, he doesn't retreat. He builds a bigger wall and waits for the enemy to break themselves against it. By the time Saul Panzer arrived at the Brownstone at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the atmosphere in the office had shifted from defensive to predatory. Saul is the only man I know who can look like a retired grocery clerk and a world-class operative at the same time. He sat on the edge of the red leather chair, his old brown felt hat balanced on his knee, looking as if he'd just come in for a chat about the weather rather than a report on a high-stakes conspiracy. Wolfe was back from his afternoon session with the orchids, his glass of beer appearing at his elbow as if by magic from Fritz's hand. The man in the yellow room was still dead to tea. He whirled, leaving us with a house full of secrets and a ledger of potential enemies that Saul had spent the last 4 hours compiling. I took my notebook and waited. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed, which is his version of being at full attention. Saul didn't need notes. His memory is a steel trap that never rusts. He started by laying out the roster of the people who moved in Sterling van. Ease orbit, and it didn't take long for the circle to form. It wasn't just a list of names, it was a map of motives. According to Saul's digging, Vane wasn't acting alone. He was the front man for a consortium that called itself the Midnight Syndicate. A name so melodramatic I almost laughed until Saul explained their portfolio. They dealt in information, the kind of information that changes the rice of gold, or the outcome of a cabinet reshuffle. Saul identified 4 primary players who had been seen with Vane at a private club in Midtown just 48 hours ago. First, there was Baroness Elena von Stross, a woman whose family had lost everything in the war but who had somehow managed to claw back a fortune in continental shipping. She had the elegance of a blade and the reputation of 1-2. Then came Marcus Thorne, an industrialist with a face like a slab of granite and a temper to match. He'd been pushing for a government contract that would essentially give him a monopoly on titanium. Third was Julian Sorel, a disgraced diplomat who now made his living as a consultant for various embassies. He was the kind of man who knew where the bodies were buried because he'd usually provided the shovels. "And the fourth?" Wolfe asked, his voice a low rumble. "A man named Avery Finch," Saul said, his eyes narrowing. "He's the wild card, a former intelligence officer with a penchant for rare books and expensive habits. He was the one seen arguing with Penhaligon, our guest upstairs, at a gallery opening last week. Witnesses say it's not art. It was about a debt that hadn't been ID. In 20 years, Wolfe opened his eyes and took a sip of beer. The black invitation. It was never a debt of money, Saul. It was a debt of silence. These four, along with Vane and our unconscious friend upstairs, represent the remnants of a failed shadow cabinet. They were the architects of a peace treaty that never saw the light of day because it was built on the foundations of blackmail. Pen. Halligan was the archivist. He kept the records. If he has decided to emerge from the shadows, he is a threat to every one of them, which gives all of them a reason to want him perforated. As Archie puts it, I noted, scribbling the names into my book. But who pulled the trigger, or in this case, pushed the needle? Vane seems too polished to do his own dirty work. The Baroness probably wouldn't. T want to ruin her manicure. Thorne is a bruiser, but he's too high profile. Sorrel is a coward. That leaves Finch. Or a fifth party we haven't identified, Wolfe muttered. A circle is rarely as simple as it appears. Saul, I want you to look into the Baroness's recent shipments, specifically anything arriving at Pier 54. Archie, you will have a busy evening. I want you to invite these four individuals to the Brownstone. Not yet for confrontation. Invite them for an informal inquiry regarding the recovery of a certain black card. Tell them that Nero Wolfe has found something they lost, and he is considering to whom it should be returned. You want me to bait the hook with the black invitation? I asked. That's like waving a red flag at a bull and then inviting the bull into your livy. Room for tea. They'll come here with more than just business cards, Mr. Wolfe. Vane already showed us he's willing to play rough. Precisely, Wolfe said, his lips tightening into what might have been a smile on a less substantial man. Let them bring their shadows and their threats. A man who is afraid is a man who makes mistakes. I want to observe them in this room. I want to see how the bar. Oness reacts to the smell of Fritz's cooking. I want to see if Thorne can keep his hands still when he is denied what he wants. We are not looking for a killer yet, Archie. We are looking for a crack in the granite. I spent the next hour on the phone, using every ounce of charm and veiled threat I had in my arsenal. It's an art form, really, telling someone they might be in deep trouble while Mackie. It sounds like you're doing them a personal favor by letting them talk to your boss. By 6 p.m., appointments were set. They were coming. They were angry, they were curious, and they were all lying about why they cared so much about a man they claimed not to know. As I hung up the phone for the final time, I looked over at Wolfe. He was leaning back again, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced. Over his middle. To the casual observer, he looked like he was napping. I knew better. He was building the stage, setting the lights, and waiting for the actors to take their places. The circle of suspects was closing in on West 35th Street. For the first time since the man fell across our threshold, I felt the familiar itch in my palms. The legwork was about to begin, and in this game, the Cidois. LK was the only place where the truth didn't have a roof over its head. I started the morning by checking on our guest in the yellow room. He was still alive, which was a plus, but he was breathing with a heavy rattling sound that made me glad I wasn't the one who had to explain him to the Board of Health. Wolfe was already in the plant rooms, probably telling Dendrobium about the various ways Saint. Erling Vane had insulted his dignity the day before. I had my own agenda. If Wolfe was going to play the stationary spider in the center of the web, I had to be the one out on the sidewalk kicking over rocks to see what crawled out. My first stop was the neighborhood near Gramercy Park, where Avery Finch kept an apartment that probably cost more in monthly maintenance than I made in a year. I didn't go to the front door. That's for people who want to be told not at home. Instead, I spent 2 hours in a nearby coffee shop with a window view, watching the ebb and flow of the high-rent district. I saw Finch leave at 10. He was a small, nervous-looking man who moved like he expected a piano to fall on him at any second. He hailed a cab and I was right behind him in the Heron. He didn't run. For office. He went to a dusty little bookstore on 4th Avenue that looked like it hadn't seen a vacuum cleaner since the Hoover administration. I parked half a block away and walked in 3 minutes after him. The air inside smelled like decaying paper and forgotten dreams. I found Finch in the back, huddled over a glass case with an elderly man who looked like he was made of parchment. Rent looking at first editions. They were looking at a ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume that looked suspiciously like the one Penhaligon might have kept. I leaned against a shelf of Victorian poetry and cleared my throat. "It's a bit early for research, isn't it, Mr. Finch? Or are you looking for a recipe for a black invitation?" Finch spun around so fast he nearly knocked over a stack of encyclopedias. His face went the color of a bad oyster. "Who the devil are you? And how do you know that name?" "The name is Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe. We're the ones currently hosting your friend Arthur, the one who took a shortcut through a knife on his way to our house. You look like a man who's lost something, and I'm beginning to think it might be sitting right there in that case." Finch's eyes darted to the ledger and then back to me. He tried for a look of indignant outrage, but it came out as a weak flutter. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Arthur Penhaligon is a thief and a traitor. If he's at Wolfe's house, you'd do well to turn him over to the proper authorities before you find yourself in a cell next to him." "We like the company we keep," I said, stepping closer. "But here's the thing, Wolfe doesn't like being lied to, and he especially doesn't like people bleeding on his rugs. If that book in the case has a list of names that matches the one Saul Panzer gave me yesterday, you're in for a very long afternoon. Why don't you come at 8? We're having a little get-together. The Baroness will be there, and Thorne too. It'll be just like old times, only with fewer secrets and more uncomfortable questions." I didn't wait for an answer. I left him there trembling and headed uptown to Pier 54. Saul had mentioned the Baroness had a shipment coming in, and I wanted to see if shipping was just a polite word for something more sinister. The docks were a different world, grey, loud, and smelling of salt and diesel. I found the crate marked with the Von Stroh's crest. It was being guarded by 2 men who looked like they'd been recruited from a local wrestling ring. I didn't try to get close. I went to the foreman's shack, flashed a piece of paper that looked official enough if you didn't read it too closely, and asked about the manifest. A $10 bill did the rest of the talking. The shipment wasn't machinery or textiles, it was archival materials, being moved from a private estate in Switzerland. Heavy stuff. The kind of stuff you move when you're trying to erase a history or write a new one. As I walked back to the car, I felt eyes on my neck. I didn't turn around, but I used the reflection in a shop window to catch a glimpse of a black sedan, the same one Vane had used. They were tailing me, which meant they were nervous. When they're neigh, or voos, they get sloppy. I led them on a merry chase through the garment district, doubled back through a one-way alley that I knew was clear, and left them stuck behind a delivery truck on 34th Street. I got back to the Brownstone at 4. Wolfe was in the office nursing a second beer. I gave him the rundown, Finch's ledger, the Baroness's archival shipment, and the tale. He listened without moving a muscle, his eyes fixed on the wall map of Yugoslavia, as if he could see the ghosts of 20 years ago moving across the terrain. "The ledger Finch was inspecting is a decoy," Wolfe said finally. "The real records are with Penhaligon or are hidden. The Baroness is moving her evidence out of the country, and Finch is trying to find a replacement to save his own skin. They are all desperate, Archie. And desperate people are remarkably predictable. Predictable maybe, but they're also armed," I reminded him. "The black sedan is still circling the block. They know we've got Penhaligon, and they know we've got the card. What's the next move?" "The next move is to wait," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that tone of finality that usually meant he was done talking for an hour. "The by-T is set. The suspects believe they are the hunters. By 8 o'clock tonight, they will discover that the Brownstone is not a sanctuary for their secrets, but a cage." I went to the kitchen to see what Fritz was doing with the squabs. If it was going to be a long night, I wanted a full stomach. But as I walked past the basement door, I noticed something. A small, almost invisible dusting of white. Powder on the floor near the sill. Flour? No. It was plaster dust. Someone had been tinkering with the foundation. The siege wasn't just coming from the street. It was already inside the walls. The plaster dust by the basement door was the first crack in the Brownstone's armor, but it wasn't the last. I didn't mention it to Wolfe immediately. He was in one of his moods where the slightest hint of domestic imperfection could send him into a week-long sulk, and we had enough on our plate with a dying man and a looming confrontation. I kept my eyes open as I moved through the house, checking the locks and the window bolts. It wasn't until I reached the plant rooms on the roof to fetch Wolfe for his 6 o'clock session that I saw the real sacrilege. Orchid rooms are Wolfe's cathedral, the Humi. Ditty is constant, the light is filtered to a precise lux, and the silence is heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. Theodore Horstman was at the far end of the intermediate house reporting a batch of cattleya, but he wasn't the one who had disturbed the peace. In the center of the bench, where a particularly rare phalaenopsis usually sat, a specimen Wolfe had spent 3 years coaxing into, a spectacular pale violet bloom. There was a gap. The orchid hadn't been stolen. It had been moved. It was sitting 3 feet away, tucked behind a screen of common ferns. In its place was a small square object wrapped in oilcloth. I didn't touch it. I went and got Wolfe. When he saw the displaced orchid, his face didn't just turn red, it went a shade of purple that would have made the phalaenops. Is jealous. He stood there for a full minute, his chest heaving under his yellow silk vest, the air around him practically vibrating with a silent tectonic fury. "Archie," he said, his voice a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Who has been here?" "Theodore was here all afternoon," I said, keeping my voice low. "He says he didn't see a soul, but whoever it was didn't come through the front door." I found plaster dust by the basement entrance. Someone knows the old coal chute layout, or they've got a key to the service door we haven't used in a decade. Wolfe gestured toward the oilcloth package. "Open it. Use the tweezers from the potting bench." I did as I was told. Inside the oilcloth was a single silver-plated dessert spoon. It was heavy, old-fashioned, and engraved with a crest I didn't recognize, a shield with a broken spear. There was also a note, written in a cramped, scholarly hand. "The feast is prepared. We only require the host." "That's not just a spoon," I said, looking at the crest. "That's a calling card." "It is a piece of the service from the Villa d'Este," Wolfe murmured, his anger cooling into a sharp, icy focus. "The site of the original dinner 20 years ago. The broken spear is the mark of the Penhaligon family. It is a warning, Archie. They are telling me that they can reach into the very heart of my home. They have trespassed upon my orchids to prove that no corner of this house is sacred." "It's more than a warning," I said. "It's a psychological jab. They know you won't leave the house, so they're bringing the threat to the one place, yo. Feel safe. It's a classic move. Shake the foundation so the man inside loses his footing." Wolfe turned away from the potting bench and walked toward the elevator. He didn't look at the orchid again. "They have made a mistake. They believe that by disturbing my peace they will provoke a retreat. They do not realize that they have merely simplified the problem. Before, this was a matter of curio. City and a bleeding man. Now, it is a matter of restitution." We went down to the office. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long orange shadows across the red leather chairs. The house felt different now, smaller, more vulnerable. I found myself checking the corners of the room, looking for anything else that might have been rearranged. A book out of place on the shelf, a pen moved an inch to the left. It's a hell of a feeling knowing someone has been walking through your life while you were looking the other way. I went to the kitchen and told Fritz to stay in the office for the rest of the evening once the guests arrived. I wanted him near the alarm button. Then I went to the basement. The coal chute was secure, but the old service door, a heavy wooden thing that led to the alley, had a scratch on the lock that hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been picked. It had been opened with a key. That changed things. A key meant an inside job, or at least a very long-term plan. I thought about the suspects. The Baroness had the resources, Vane had arrogance, Thorne had the muscle. But Finch had the history. When I came back upstairs, Wolfe was sitting at his desk staring at the silver spoon. He hadn't touched his beer. "Saul called while you were downstairs," I said. "He's found something. The Baroness didn't just have archival materials on that pier. She had a passenger, a man named Galt, who was a chef at Villa d'Este. He disappeared shortly after the Black Invitation dinner 20 years ago." Wolfe raised his eyebrows. "A chef? How poetic. The man who prepared. The meal is now the man who prepares the end." "There's more," I added. "Saul says Galt was seen meeting with Sterling Vane this morning. They weren't talking about recipes. They were looking at a map of West 35th Street. Wolfe finally reached for his glass, but he didn't drink. He held it up to the light, watching the bubbles rise. The trespass was not just a threat, Archie. It was a rehearsal. They came for the orchid to see if they could reach me. Tonight, they will come to Penhaligon, and they will find that I have rearranged the seating chart. What's the plan? I asked. The guests will be here in 2 hours. We've got a chef with a grudge, a baroness with a boat, and a man upstairs who's the only one with the real story. The plan, Wolfe said, is to allow them to believe their tea. Respass was successful. We will leave the yellow room guarded, but not too heavily. We will invite them into this office, and we will offer them the one thing they cannot resist, the truth. And while they are distracted by the truth, we will let the intruder discover exactly what happens to those who disturb my orchids. He looked at me, his eyes hard. Call Saul. Tell him I need him in the basement. NT and Archie. Tell Fritz to prepare the 1906 brandy. If we are to have a funeral for a secret, we should at least provide the proper spirits. I went to the phone. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a coiled spring. The displaced orchid was just the beginning. The real trespass was about to begin, and I had a feeling the silver spoon wasn't the only piece of the service they intend. Ed to return. Saul Panzer arrived through the front door at 7 o'clock, looking more like a man who had come to repair a leaking faucet than a world-class operative ready to defend a fortress. He was wearing an old canvas jacket and carrying a tool bag that clinked with every step, but the look in his eyes told me he was ready for whatever the night had planned. I didn't waste time with small tea. Alk. I took him straight to the basement, leaving Wolfe in the office to contemplate the silver spoon and the impending arrival of our guests. In the dim light of the cellar, among the stacks of crates and the hum of the furnace, I showed Saul the scratch on the service door and the dusting of plaster by the coal chute. Saul knelt down, his fingers tracing the marks with the delicacy of a surgeon. He didn't need to be told what they meant. He spent 5 minutes checking angles and sightlines before he looked up at me. They didn't just pick the lock, Archie, Saul whispered, his voice barely audible over the furnace. They have a duplicate. And whoever was here wasn't just exploring. See the way the dust is settled on this rack? They were looking for the house's electrical mains. They want the option to kill the lights when the time is right. Wolfe thinks it's Galt, the chef from the Villa d'Este, I said. He's working with Van and the Baroness. They want Penhaligon, and they want him quiet. Saul nodded, standing up and dusting off his knees. Galt was always a shadow. Even 20 years ago, he was the man who saw everything and said nothing. If he's the one who was in here, he already mapped the house. He knows exactly where the yellow room is, and he knows the back stairs lead straight to it. Then we change the map, I said. Wolfe wants you down here. If anyone comes through that door, you're the reception committee. Don't worry about being polite. If the lights go out, I'll be on the 3rd floor. Fritz will be in the office with Wolfe. We've got the house cover. D from top to bottom. I left Saul at his business and went back upstairs. The Brownstone was settling into its nighttime rhythm, but there was a tension in the air that made every floorboard creak sound like a gunshot. I went to the yellow room on the 3rd floor. Our guest Penhaligon was awake. He looked pale and fragile, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected the walls to close in. On him. Mr. Wolfe is ready to see your friends now, I told him, checking the bandage on his side. He's having them in the office at 8. You stay put. I've moved the bolt on the outside of this door, and I'll be right across the hall in the darkness. If anyone tries to get in, they'll have to deal with me first. Penhaligon reached out and grabbed my sleeve, his grip surprisingly strong for a man in his condition. You don't understand, Goodwin. It's not just the records, it's about the 14th. The invitation wasn't just a list, it was a sentence. If they find me, they don't just kill a man, they bury a truth that could burn half the governments in Europe. Wolfe likes a good fire, I said, gently prying his hand away. Just keep your head down. I went to my post in the hallway. The first of the guests arrived. From my vantage point at the top of the stairs, I could hear the heavy thud of the front door and Fritz's polite, measured voice as he ushered them into the office. One by one, the Midnight Syndicate players took their places. First came Vane, his voice sharp and demanding. then the heavy rhythmic tread of Marcus Thorne, followed by the light, clicking heels of the Baroness. Julian Sorrel arrived last, sounding breathless and nervous, his voice a high-pitched trill that grated on my nerves. I sat in the shadows of the third-floor landing, my hand resting on the cold steel of the automatic in my shoulder holster. Below me the house was alive with the sound of Wolfe's voice, a low melodic rumble that signaled the start of his performance. He was playing Cheech, part of the gracious host, but I knew he was watching their every move, looking for the flicker of a gaze or the twitch of a finger that would betray the intruder's plan. Suddenly the house went cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was a shift in the atmosphere. The hum of the furnace cut out, and then, with a sharp metallic click, the lights vanished. The brownstone was plunged into a darkness so thick it felt like velvet. Downstairs I heard the Baroness gasp and the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Wolfe's voice remained calm, cutting through the sudden panic like a lighthouse beam. "Please, stay seated. My assistant is checking the fuses. It is a common occurrence in these old houses." But I knew it wasn't the fuses. I heard the faint, rhythmic creak of the back star. IRS, the ones that led from the kitchen to the upper floors. Someone was moving with incredible speed and silence. I didn't head for the stairs. I stepped into the doorway of the yellow room, my back against the frame, and waited. A shadow appeared at the end of the hallway. It was tall, lean, and moved with a grace that suggested it was used to navigating the dark. It didn't have a flashlight. It didn't need one. It headed straight for Penhaligon's door. I waited until it was 3 feet away, until I could hear the faint, wheezing breath of a man who had spent too many years over a hot stove. "The kitchen is downstairs, Galt," I said, my voice a flat rasp in the darkness. "And we're not hungry for what you're serving." The shadow froze. For a heartbeat there was nothing but the sound of breathing. Then the silence was shattered by a muffled thud from the basement, the unmistakable sound of Saul Panzer taking out the trash. The shadow didn't lung or flee, it simply evaporated back into the darkness of the hallway. I didn't give chase. My job wasn't to play tag in the dark, it was to keep the door to the yellow room closed and Penhaligon's heart beating. I stood there for 10 seconds, hearing the house. The brownstone is old, and it has a vocabulary of its own. The groan of the joists, the rattle of the radiators. But there was a new sound now, the frantic, muffled scuffle of someone realizing the exit they had planned was no longer an option. Below me, the office was a cauldron of voices. Thorne was shouting about being trapped, and the Baroness was demanding a light in a tone that suggested she expected the darkness to apologize to her. Then the lights flickered and surged back to life. Saul had found the breaker. I didn't wait to see if Galt was still in the hall. I knew where he was going. There was only one other way down besides the back stairs, and that was the service lift behind the linen closet. I made it to the landing just as the elevator began its slow, whining descent. I headed down the main staircase, taking them 3 at a time. When I hit the first floor, the office door was open. Wolfe was standing by his desk, a rare sight, as he usually treats his chair like a throne he's been glued to, and his face was a mask of cold, hard intellect. He hadn't moved to help his guests. He had simply watched them. Vane, Thorne, the Baroness and Sorrel were huddling near the center of the room. They looked less like a powerful syndicate and more like a group of tourists who had taken a wrong turn into a lion's den. Saul appeared from the hallway, his face calm, his jacket slightly more rumpled than before. He held a heavy, brass-handled key in his hand. "The basement is clear, Mr. Wolfe," Saul said. The intruder moved upward. "I've locked the service entrance and the coal chute. He's contained within the upper floors or the kitchen annex." "Thank you, Saul," Wolfe said. He turned his gaze toward the 4 suspects. "Now, if you would be so kind as to return to your seats. The theatrics are over. The man you sent to finish your business is currently realizing that my house is not as porous as he was led to believe." "This is an outrage," Thorne bellowed, his face a deep shade of crimson. "You've held us here against our will, the lights go out, and now you're talking about intruders? I'm calling my lawyer. You may call the Archbishop of Canterbury if it pleases you," Wolfe snapped. the volume of his voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "But you will do so after you explain the silver spoon. Or perhaps you would after I explain it to Inspector Kramer. I have already informed him that I am hosting a gathering of individuals connected to the Black Invitation. He is, at this moment, sitting in a patrol car 2 blocks away, waiting for my signal." That was a beautiful lie. Kramer was likely at his desk at the precinct, chewing on a cold cigar and hating the world, but the suspects didn't know that. Mention of Black Invitation acted as a physical blow. Sorrel actually sagged into his chair, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them in his lap. "The spoon," Wolfe continued, gesturing to the silver piece on his desk, "a relic of the Villa d'Este. It was placed in my orchid rooms today by a man who knows this house far better than a stranger should, a man who was once a chef, and who now serves a specialty cleaner for your little syndicate. Mr. Galt." The Baroness straightened her back, her eyes like chips of blue ice. "If Galt is here, he is acting on his own initiative. We came here to discuss Arthur Penhaligon's return. He is a thief, Mr. Wolfe. He stole a ledger containing sensitive diplomatic records. We only wish to see them returned to their rightful owners. The rightful own. RS being the men and women who used those records to build empires on the bones of their rivals?" Wolfe asked. "I think not. Penhaligon did not steal the ledger, he saved it. He knew that once the Midnight Syndicate was formed, the records would be used not for diplomacy, but for extortion. He came to me because he knew I am the only man with the stubbornness to keep it, and the wit to understand. I moved to the corner of the room, keeping my back to the wall. I could see the sweat on Vane's forehead. He was the one who had been the most confident, the one who had threatened to dismantle the house brick by brick. Now, he looked like a man who realized the bricks were much heavier than he had anticipated. "You have no proof," Vane said, his voice cracking. "You have a bleeding man upstairs. IRS and a silver spoon. That won't hold up in a courtroom." "I am not interested in a courtroom, Mr. Vane," Wolfe said, leaning forward. "I am interested in the truth. And the truth is that one of you gave Galt the key to my house. One of you has been planning this trespass for years, waiting for the moment Penhaligon would break. You didn't just want the ledger, you wanted to ensure that the 14th, the final secret of the Villa d'Este, never came to light." Wolfe's eyes moved from one face to the next, a slow, predatory sweep. "I know who you are. I have seen the way you look at the clock, the way you avoid the Baroness's eyes, and the way you flinched when the lights came back on. You aren't afraid of the police, Mr. Vane. You're afraid of what Galt will say when he realizes you've effed him to hang." The room went silent. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, a steady, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. The noose was tightening. Wolfe wasn't just guessing, he was weaving their own fears into a shroud. He had positioned them exactly where he wanted them, distrustful of each other, terrified of the man in the walls, and trapped in a room where the only way out was through him. "Archie," Wolfe said, not taking his eyes off Vane, "bring the brandy, and tell Fritz to prepare the office for a final guest. I believe Mr. Galt is ready to join the party." I headed for the door, but I kept my hand near my holster. The atmosphere in the room was electric. The suspects were no longer a syndicate. There were 4 people on a sinking ship, each wondering who would be the first to jump. I didn't have to go far to find our final guest. Galt was in the dining room, backed into a corner near the sideboard, looking less like a master assassin and more like a scullery maid caught stealing the silver. Saul Panzer was standing 5 feet away, not pointing a gun. Saul rarely needed to, but simply occupying the space in a way that made it clear the dining room was the end of the line. Galt's white chef's jacket, which he'd apparently worn under his overcoat for some sense of professional armor, was smudged with soot from the basement. He looked at me with the hollow eyes of a man who had seen his retirement plan go up in smoke. "The party's moving back to the office, Galt," I said, stepping aside to give him a path. "Mr. Wolfe has a place set for you. No cooking required, just a bit of conversation." I led him into the office. The transition was like moving from a cold cellar into a courtroom. The 4 members of the Midnight Syndicate were still seated, though seated implies a level of comfort they didn't possess. They looked like they were, sitting on crates of dynamite. When Galt entered, Julian Sorel let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, Sturley. Van remained motionless, but I saw the muscle in his jaw jump like a trapped nerve. Wolfe was back in his chair, the center of gravity for the entire room. He watched Galt approach the small, straight-backed chair I had placed facing the desk. Fritz followed behind me with a tray of brandy snifters, moving with a calm dignity that made the high-priced crooks in the room look like amateurs. "See. Tea, Mr. Galt," Wolfe commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Galt sat. "You are a man of many talents, a chef of some renown at the Villa d'Este, a locksmith of surprising proficiency, and a ghost who has haunted the peripheries of European politics for 2 decades. It is a pity you chose to haunt my house. I am famously intolerant of shadows." Galt looked at the floor. "I was told the man was a traitor." "I was told he had the ledger." "And who told you that?" Wolfe asked, his voice silky. "Who gave you the duplicate key to my service door? A key that must have been fashioned years ago when this house was first surveyed by your employers." Galt's eyes flickered toward the semicircle of suspects, but he didn't speak. "Silence is a costly commodity, Mr. Galt," Wolfe said, leaning forward. "The lie." Tea from the desk lamp caught the gold of his ring. "Particularly when the people who bought it are currently debating which of them will be the first to sacrifice you to the authorities. Look at them. Do they look like people who will stand by you when Inspector Kramer begins his inquiry into the attempted murder of Arthur Penhaligon?" Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, a sound like grinding gravel. "You're badgering the man, Wolfe. He has nothing to do with us." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe snapped. "He has everything to do with you. He is the physical manifestation of your collective greed, but he is not the one who interests me most. The man who truly interests me is the one who knew that the 14th, the secret at the heart of the Black Invitation, was not a document at all, BU. A person whose existence makes this entire syndicate a house of cards." I watched the suspects. The Baroness was staring at her manicured nails. Vane was staring at Wolfe. Sorel was staring at nothing. 20 years ago, Wolfe continued, at the Villa d'Este, 14 men sat down to dinner, but only 13 names appeared on the official roster. The 14th guest was the shadow, T, his silent partner who financed the gathering and who has, for 20 years, pulled the strings from behind a curtain of respectability. Penhaligon didn't steal a ledger of names. He stole the identity proof for this 14th guest, and that guest is in this room. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against the windows. I approached the desk, my eyes scanning the 4 faces. I've seen some good poker players in my time, but these people were playing for stakes that didn't involve chips. "Mr. Vane," Wolfe said suddenly, "you were the one who arrived first. You were the one who threatened me with an affair of state. You acted as the leader, but a leader does not panic when the lights go out. A leader does not flinch when a silver spoon is produced. You are merely the ambitious footman, Vane. You were given the key and told to manage the problem." Vane's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "And you, Baroness," Wolfe moved on, his voice a relentless drumbeat. "You provided the transport. You provided the muscle on the docks. But you are a woman of calculated risks. You would never have authorized a messy assassination on my door step unless you were being squeezed by someone who held your entire shipping empire in their hand." The Baroness didn't look up. She didn't have to. "That leaves the man who has spent the evening pretending to be a victim of his own temper," Wolfe said, his gaze settling on Marcus Thorne. "Or the man who has spent it pretending to be a coward. Mr. Sorrel, you have played the part of the trembling diplomat with great skill. It is a classic mask. But when the lights went out, I did not hear you gasp. I heard you move. You didn't move toward the door, as a frightened man would. You moved toward the desk. You were looking for the black card, weren't you? The card you believe is the key to the 14th's identity." Sorel looked up, and the mask of the shaking diplomat vanished, his face smooth, fed out into something cold, sharp, and infinitely more dangerous. "A black card is just a piece of paper, Wolfe, and Penhaligon is just a dying man. You're playing a very dangerous game with people you don't understand. "I understand you perfectly," Julian, Wolfe said, and for the first time he sounded almost bored. "You are the 14th, the man who wasn't there, and you are about to discover that in this house you are very much present." Wolfe signaled to me. "Archie, bring the final proof from the safe. I believe it's time we showed Mr. Sorrel why his dinner party is over." I turned toward the safe, but out of the corner of my eye I saw Galt move. He wasn't looking at Wolfe, he was looking at Sorrel, and the look on his face wasn't fear, it was a deep, simmering betrayal. The Offic. E-gathering was about to reach its boiling point. I went to the safe, not to fetch a document, but to pull out a small, velvet-lined box that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. I placed it on the desk blotter between Wolfe and the man who had stopped trembling. Sorrel didn't look at the box. He kept his eyes on Wolfe, but his breathing had become shallow. The rest of the syndicate, Vane, Thorne, and T, Baroness, seemed to have shrunk into their upholstery, suddenly realizing that they weren't the co-conspirators they thought they were. They were just the scenery for Sorrel's solo performance. Wolfe didn't open the box immediately. He leaned back, the springs of his chair protesting the shift of his massive weight. "You see, Mr. Sorrel, your mistake was culinary proportions. You assumed that you provided the ingredients, you controlled the meal. But a dinner is more than its components. It is the record of its consumption. You spent 20 years making sure the 14th guest remained a ghost, a financier without a face, a diplomat without a portfolio. You used Penhaligon to keep the ledger, believing his loyalty to the old world would keep him silent. But when Penhaligon realized you intended to use the Midnight Syndicate to start a fire that would consume the very peace you once pretended to broker, he didn't just run, he took the one thing that could prove you were at the Villa d'Este." "The card is a blank," Sorrel said, his voice now a steady metallic rasp. "A gold number 14 on black stock proves nothing but a printer's fee. The card is indeed a blank woe." LFE agreed, his voice deceptively mild. But the card was not the only thing Penhaligon carried. He also carried a memory of the service. "Archie, if you please." I flipped the lid of the box. Inside was the silver spoon I had retrieved from the orchid rooms, but next to it lay a second piece, a heavy, ornate silver napkin ring. It bore the same crest, the shield with the broken spear, but on the inside of the band there was a crude, deep scratch. It wasn't a jeweler's mark, it was a monogram, scratched into the silver with the tip of a steak knife. "JS, a sentimentalist's blunder," Wolfe said, his eyes hard. 20 years ago, during the final toast at the Villa d'Este, you felt a surge of ego. You were the man behind the curtain, the architect of a new Europe, and you couldn't resist leave. "Inga Mark. You defaced the host's silver. You thought it was a private joke. But Penhaligon saw you do it. He didn't say a word. He simply waited until the table was cleared and pocketed the evidence of your presence. He kept it for 2 decades as his life insurance. When Galt came to this house today to plant the spoon, he was trying to signal to Penhaligon that the service was being completed, that the debt was being called in. But Galt didn't know that I already had the napkin ring." Galt stood up, his face a mask of sudden, violent clarity. He looked at Sorrel, then at the napkin ring. You told me he stole from the till. You told me he was selling the codes to the Soviets. You sent me here to kill a thief. I sent you to recover property." Sorrel snapped, his composure finally fracturing. "The details were irrelevant." "The details are everything," Wolfe thundered, his voice filling the room like a physical pressure. "You sent a man to commit murder in my house to cover a scratch on a piece of silver. You manipulated these 3 fools into a syndicate to fund your private vendettas, and you used a man's professional pride as a chef to turn him into a stalker. But you got one thing, Mr. Sorrel. In this house, I am the host, and I do not care for guests who bring their own poison." Wolfe turned his gaze to the others. The Black Invitation was never a secret society, it was a blackmail ring. Sorrel used the names of those 13 men to squeeze their estates for 20 years. Vane, your father was the 4th guest. Baroness, your husband was the 9th. Thorne, your predecessor at the shipyard, was the 12th. You weren't his partners. You were his victims, paying into the syndicate to keep the ghost of the Villa d'Este from ruining your reputations. Sorel was simply moving the money from your pockets to his own. The reaction was instantaneous. Thorne stood up, his massive fists curling into white-knuckled stones. The Baroness let out a long, slow hiss of breath, her eyes turning on Sorel with a lethal focus. Vane looked like he'd been slapped awake with a bucket of ice water. "Is this true?" Thorne growled, stepping towards Sorel. "The titanium contract, the fees we've been paying to the Swiss accounts, that was just you." Sorel tried to stand, his hand darting toward his breast pocket, but I was fast. I had the barrel of my .38 levelled at his tie before he could clear his lapels. "Keep it in the holster, Julian. This isn't a diplomatic function." "It's over," Wolfe said, the finality in his tone like a gavel. "Saul, I believe the men in the patrol car have waited long enough. Archie, call the precinct. Tell Inspector Kramer that I have the man who stabbed Arthur Penhaligon. And more important, Lee, I have the man who gave the order. Tell him to bring extra handcuffs. The Midnight Syndicate is having its final course." As I moved to the phone, Galt sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The three partners were closing in on Sorel, their shared hatred for their blackmailer finally outweighing their fear of the scandal. Wolfe simply watched them, his fingers once again in Turler. Said, over his middle, his expression one of grim, intellectual satisfaction. The sanctity of the Brownstone had been restored, and the 14th guest had finally been forced to settle the check. The following morning, the Brownstone smelled of beeswax and coffee rather than damp plaster and desperation. The police had cleared out around 3:00 a.m., taking Sorel, Vane, and the others with them. Inspe. Seator Kramer had lingered the longest, standing on the rug and chewing a cigar he wasn't allowed to light, looking from Wolfe to the ceiling as if he expected the architecture itself to explain how a 20-year-old European ghost story had ended up in a Manhattan precinct blotter. He hadn't thanked us. Kramer considers a lack of an indictment against me or Wolfe to be thanks enough, but he had taken the napkin ring and the black card with a grim sort of respect. I was at my desk finishing the bank deposit slips and listening to the hum of the vacuum cleaner in the hallway. Fritz was being thorough. He didn't like the idea of any lingering traces of Sorel's presence. Upstairs, Penhaligon was still resting. Though Dr. Vollmer had reported his fever had broken, he was no longer a man on the run. He was a man with a very long story to tell the district attorney, and for the first time in 2 decades he'd be telling it without looking over his shoulder. Wolfe came down from the plant rooms at 11 o'clock sharp. He navigated the elevator, crossed the office, and settled into his chair with a grunt that signaled a return to the status quo. He spent a few minutes looking over the morning mail, dismissing 3 prospective clients with a flick of his wrist, before he looked at me. "Archie, has the rug been seen?" "Fritz treated it like a holy relic," I said. "You could eat off that hallway now, though I wouldn't recommend it. The dry cleaner is picking up your yellow silk vest this afternoon. Apparently being a target for international blackmailers is hard on the wardrobe." Wolfe ignored the jab. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the portrait of Sherlock Holmes on the opposite wall. "A singular business, Archie. The vanity of the human animal never ceases to provide a spectacle. Mr. Sorel spent 20 years constructing a fortress of shadows, only to have it dismantled by a piece of silver and a man's refusal to die on the sidewalk. It wasn't just the silver, I reminded him. It was the orchids. If they hadn't moved that phalaenopsis, you might have let Sorel walk out of here with his secrets intact. You can threaten a man's life, but you shouldn't mess with his potting bench." Wolfe's lips tightened. The trespass was the catalyst, yes, but the root rot was dinner itself. The black invitation was an exercise in hubris. Those men believed they could dictate the course of history through the leverage of their own vices. They forgot that a secret shared among 14 people is no longer a secret. It is a conspiracy waiting for a betrayal. Sorel's mistake was not in the blackmail, but in the belief that he could remain the 14th guest forever. No man can sit at a table and remain invisible to the waiter. "Speaking of tables," I said, glancing at Cheech. "E-clock. Fritz mentioned something about a ragao for lunch. I assume we're back to our regular programming?" Wolfe shifted his gaze to me, his expression softening just a fraction. Almost. There is the silver spoon issue. I want it returned to the Villa d'Este, or what remains of it. It is a piece of a broken service, and I will not have it cluttering my drawers. It serves as a reminder of a me. That ended in disaster. I'll see to it, I said. And what about Galt? Kramer seemed to think he might get off easy if he testified against Sorrel. Mr. Galt is a technician who allowed himself to be used as a tool, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a reflective tone. He has the soul of a craftsman and the judgment of a child. He will suffer enough in the realization that his professionalism was merely a cover for a coward's errands. Ethics, Archie, are not a luxury of the elite. They are the foundation of any craft. When the chef begins to poison the guests, he ceases to be a chef. He picked up his book, a thick volume on the history of the Ottoman Empire, and opened it to his mark. The case was officially closed. The ledger was in the hands of the authorities, the syndicate was in the hands of the law, and the Brownstone was once again a private fortress dedicated to the pursuit of fine food, rare orchids, and the occasional intellectual skirmish. I stood up and stretched, feeling the kink in my back from the long night on the third-floor landing. You know, I said, heading toward the door, it's a good thing you don't like dinner parties, Wolfe. Between the blackmail and the stabbings, it's a wonder anyone ever makes it to the dessert course. Wolfe didn't look up from his book. That is why I dine at home, Archie. The company is predictable, the ingredients are honest, and the only invitations I issue are those I intend to honor. Now see if Fritz requires any assistance with the wine. I believe we earned a decent vintage today. I grinned and walked out into the hallway. The sun was streaming through the front door's glass, hitting the spot where Penhaligon had fallen. There was no sign of the blood, no sign of the struggle. It was just a house on West 35th Street again, quiet and immovable. I headed for the kitchen, thinking that maybe Wolfe was right. In a world full of black invitations and secret ledgers, a good ragout and a quiet room were the only things that really settled the check. And Archie? Wolfe's voice drifted from the office, sharp and clear. Yeah? Tell Fritz no more than 2 shallots. We've had quite enough spice for 1 week. 2 shallots it is, I called back. The old boy was definitely back to normal.